When it comes to individual responsibility, imagine being in 1939 and the British government basically saying, well, it's your individual responsibility to deal with Nazi Germany. Or indeed in February 2020, saying it's your individual responsibility to deal with COVID. Absolutely, there is an element of individual responsibility. In the war, you shouldn't have been running around flashing torches in the air to hail down approaching Nazi bombers, or in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, you shouldn't be running around knowing you got COVID and coughing in people's faces. But ultimately, an individual can only do so much in the scale of those massive system-wide problems. And it still very much feels like we are in a situation where the onus is being put on individuals almost to try and cover up for the failures of leadership that we see in governments and in companies. Taking that Second World War analogy further, there was basically a message of, this is how bad the threat is. We're not going to sugarcoat it for you. We are going to act as a united country, and you will all have individual roles, sure, but you must understand that that's as the part of a collective. Scientists have been clear for decades and decades that if fossil fuel pollution continued to be put in the atmosphere, then global temperatures would rise and it would cause more extremes. And we've got to think of the weather on a given day as like rolling a dice, and the climate loads it towards certain weather each day. Warmer in Greece, cooler in the UK. What fossil fuel pollution being put in the atmosphere is doing is further loading that dice to more extremes. And we're seeing that at the moment across Europe and other parts of the world, that it's being loaded to serious, deadly, dangerous extremes. The key message from Russia's invasion of Ukraine was that fossil fuel energy is no longer secure. It's no longer going to provide us with energy security. We've had volatile fossil fuel market prices over the last couple of years, and that's damaged many countries around the world, including the UK. That was the key lesson to learn. I think some politicians have learned that and are investing huge amounts into trying to ensure their countries are no longer reliant on those unreliable and volatile fossil fuel markets. The US is a very good example of that. Other countries have not. An example of that, unfortunately, is the UK, where there was a huge opportunity to make massive investments in, say, insulation, which are a win-win because it means that we're all using less energy, we're paying less because we're using less energy, our homes are warmer, and we're less reliant on these volatile fossil fuel markets. But unfortunately, that window of opportunity was not utilised by the UK government, and that means that we are behind on our targets for energy security, as well as dealing with the climate threat. Yeah, the UK has abundant renewable electricity energy resources. It has become a world leader in offshore wind, but unfortunately, backward politics has meant that it's not a leader in, say, onshore wind, which we know there is huge support for among populations. Polling consistently shows us that actually when you have an onshore wind turbine near you, you become more of a supporter of that form of electricity. And in a world, again, where there's going to continue to be these volatility in fossil fuel prices, it is absolutely essential that every country, including the UK, exploits the vast renewable energy resources it has on its doorstep. You've got to think about the human cost of heat waves in two ways. The first is the direct way, how it impacts our health. This crushing heat will deeply affect people who are more vulnerable, who are elderly, who've got pre-existing medical conditions, and it's very difficult, as any of those people know, to outrun that heat. You get stuck in it, and it is deadly. There's then a second, an indirect effect, and that comes from the heat and the fires impacting the very functioning of our societies. These latest heat waves, the ones before that, have impacted, for example, the food system in Europe. And that has filtered back to impact countries all around the world, including the UK, by raising our food prices and sometimes meaning there's a scarcity of supply. And we, unfortunately, are only just at the beginning of how this plays out. This is going to play out not slowly and bit by bit, getting slightly worse each year. This is what scientists describe as potentially as exponential change. Let's go back to the beginning of the COVID pandemic. It felt very different in January and February to how it then abruptly felt in March. And in some ways, we're probably in that equivalent of the January, February stage where things are clearly getting worse, but they could soon accelerate and get even worse. And that's why we need to get on top of fossil fuel pollution going into the atmosphere, which is the root cause of this problem. We've already had a severe drought in Europe last year. By some measures, it was the worst in 5 centuries. We have seen hotter, more extreme conditions in Europe as the year has gone on. All areas of the food system across Europe are being impacted to some degree. A pertinent example is olive oil. It's a key, we use that in the UK. It's also used to create other foods in the UK. And those harvests are getting absolutely hammered by the severe heatwave conditions. And it looks like that's only going to get worse. So, you have to remember here that global heating has warmed the world by about 1.2 degrees centigrade since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when fossil pollution was put into the atmosphere on a massive scale, or started to be put in the atmosphere on a massive scale. As we head towards the global target of 1.5, well, we're not supposed to go over, these kind of extremes will just become normal. And the problem here is that our food system cannot change as quickly as is needed to deal with those new conditions. And it's not about rising sea levels or being worried about polar bears. Of course, those are things to be concerned about that we should have at the top of their minds. It is food crises. It's the inability to stay comfortable in cities that are too hot. It's how that could drive political instability and economic instability. That's the climate threat, the threat to the functioning of our societies. In many ways, we could see the climate crisis as manifesting in inflation all the time. And a really key example of that is the food system. So the climate crisis is driving inflation in food prices because it damages food production. Torrential rains or drought conditions or wildfires destroying crops will then mean there's less food, which then means that prices will go up. And because we have a largely globalized food system, one that's connected internationally, it means that destruction in one place will filter through to price rises in another place. And we have already seen in the UK the imprint of climate change on our food price inflation. Food prices have been very high over the last couple of years, a key part of the cost of living crisis. And by one measure, as much over a third of that food price inflation is as a consequence of climate change, as a result of food production being damaged by wildfires, by extreme storms and rains, and by drought. Well, there's got to be some element of adaptation to the climate crisis because, to put it bluntly, leaders have failed us in the past by not getting on top of this problem. And tragically, we will experience more deadly conditions now. That's unfortunately guaranteed. It's already happening around the world, and there will have to be some element of adaptation. And leaders are again failing us by not incorporating the levels of adaptation we need. The problem with a kind of view that says, oh, all we need to do is adapt, is that we will just not be able to get on top of this problem. It will keep getting warmer, more destruction will come, and we'll never be able to keep ahead of that. We'll always be kind of capable of adapting to what has just happened, but never what comes next. Because like with COVID, this problem comes at us fast. And there's only so much you can do to be ready for the next wave of more extreme destruction. We've not got a new normal now, where just summers will now be 40 degrees in the UK and there'll be 50 degrees in Europe, right? This will be a constantly shifting normal, a no normal, worsening extremes until we get on top of this. And ultimately, if we do not stop the political interest in getting in the way of stopping fossil pollution going to the atmosphere, the temperature will get to a point where it will become unlivable in certain parts of the world for many, many people. And it will become unviable to be growing food in certain parts of the world. And that is a disastrous situation that we won't be able to adapt to. So there are limits to adaptation. And the best line of defense is to deal with the root problem. The crisis is caused by entire systems. And it's quite difficult for individuals through their own behavior, through what they decide to consume, to change those entire systems. It doesn't mean that what they do as individuals, therefore, doesn't matter. Of course it does. Again, let's use COVID as an analogy. it was not the responsibility of individuals to deal with the COVID crisis. We all had individual responsibility to not behave in a certain way, to make sure that we weren't recklessly spreading the virus or so on, right? But at the end of the day, it was for powerful institutions, particularly government, to then ensure that at a bigger society-wide level, we were able to deal with those issues. No one individual can invest billions in creating vaccines. No one individual can police how people had to stay at home for a period and then provide them with money to do so. No individual can then support the NHS and public health systems to deal with the COVID threat. It is the same thing with the climate crisis, but we are in the equivalent position now where we're being told to behave in a certain way as individuals, but we're not then having twinned with that the massive response from governments and from companies. So we have that individual responsibility, but then the ones who are in control of our societies, governments and companies and so on, are negating their responsibility to provide the leadership to change the systems that are creating this, the food system that is destroying the natural environment, the international airline system that is then pumping emissions in the atmosphere and so on. No one individual can change those systems overall. We have responsibilities, but we need our leaders to step up and change those systems. The responsibility of some individuals is more important because it sends a signal. It kind of reveals their leadership, and this is why I think it is quite important that some politicians kind of model the behaviors that ultimately we all need to end up engaging in. Now, the crucial thing there is that those behaviors need to be enabled, right? So it's one thing for us to say to Rishi Sunak, well, you shouldn't be taking very short flights in the UK that you could do by train, however important you are, because I think he should be modeling the behaviors that ultimately need to happen. But we also need a functional train system that is properly constructed, that isn't late, that isn't suffering under the failures of the privatized model, to then ensure that those behaviors are enabled. We cannot be in a situation here where it almost feels like governments are saying, well, you're all going to have to buy a Tesla and spend a huge amount of money to have your gas boiler ripped out, because that is not going to be viable for so many people. So many people are already suffering as a result of the other failures in our societies, right? And so we need to be in a situation where leaders model the behaviors while then using their leadership to ensure that those behaviors are an easy alternative for people. So it is easier to get good public transport. And we see that in France at the moment, where they're looking at banning short haul flights that could be taken by train, and their train system is hopefully in a position where it will be very easy for people to do that. Every country has its own unique circumstances. I think one thing to consider, though, is the kind of baseline of what they could be doing, right? So if we're not yet in a situation, say, with the US, where the US government has invested in a pretty amazing high-speed train line that's electrified, and is now in the situation where it's then dealing with particular areas of tension. It's like, oh, we can't have a high-speed electric train line between, medium-sized city A and smaller city B because it intersects indigenous lands. That's the hard stuff. There's a huge amount of low-hanging fruit to pick, because we are in a situation where in countries like the US, there's just no high-speed electrified train line, full stop, in the places where it's pretty obvious that should happen. So, and this is why we must understand that dealing with the climate crisis, ultimately reducing fossil pollution from going into the atmosphere, can be done in a way that will improve society in a way that we should have been doing anyway. We should have been in a situation where we're improving public transport, because that would reduce air pollution in our cities. It would also probably be easier for people on lower incomes to then move around, and that would open them up to different opportunities. We could have been replanning cities to make them easier for people to move around, to make them healthier. We could have been providing better diets to people so that their health is generally better. All of those things were great, even if we didn't have the climate crisis. When it comes to individual responsibility, imagine being in 1939 and the British government basically saying, well, it's your individual responsibility to deal with Nazi Germany. Or indeed in February 2020 saying it's your individual responsibility to deal with COVID. absolutely, there is an element of individual responsibility. In the war, you shouldn't have been running around flashing torches in the air to hail down approaching Nazi bombers, or in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, you shouldn't be running around knowing you got COVID and coughing in people's faces. But ultimately, an individual can only do so much in the scale of those massive system-wide problems. And it still very much feels like we are in a situation where the onus is being put on individuals almost to try and cover up for the failures of leadership that we see in governments and in companies. Taking that Second World War analogy further, there was basically a message of, this is how bad the threat is. We're not going to sugarcoat it for you. We are going to act as a united country, and you will all have individual roles, sure, but you must understand that that's as the part of a collective. And so much of that is missing from the current situation. We are in such peril globally because of what this will do to our food systems, because it will become increasingly unlivable in parts of the world because of the heat, that we need to have a similar approach from our leaders to say that this is a unique threat that we're facing, but we can deal with it collectively. You have certain personal responsibilities, but you also have a role to play in a collective. And that's how we'll sort the problem out. And we're yet to have that style of leadership. So people are running around with just the individual responsibility part of the equation and understandably feeling exhausted, or some campaigners and so on being burnt out. And it doesn't make sense, does it? It also doesn't feel so much like a threat, because if it's just a case of individual responsibility, surely it cannot be as bad as it is, because then surely governments would kick to the gear of us working collectively. But they've not, for a number of reasons, and we need to push on them to ensure that we do have a politics that then responds to this in the collective way that we need to deal with this unprecedented threat. One of the unfortunate things is that over the last 40 to 45 years, a certain way of making policy, a certain way of making policy has dominated the minds of decision makers in governments and in companies. And it's the idea that things like regulation and that government intervention in the economy should not happen. That government only gets in the way and only disrupts the natural functioning of economies. And it was immensely unfortunate that that ideology happened to come and dominate societies at this crucial moment in tackling the climate crisis, because what it's doing is stopping us from introducing certain regulations that will keep us safe. And ultimately, this was what this comes down to: is the climate crisis is making us less secure, making us very unsafe. It's threatening our lives and livelihoods. And so we're going to have to see a change in which governments are actually using regulation to stop companies from engaging in certain activities that are driving the climate crisis, that are driving that threat, that are making us unsafe. And dealing with consumerism, dealing with how marketing and so on drives the unsustainable use of resources is a key element to that. But that doesn't mean that we have to, go and live with hair shirts and all the other cliches about a kind of green austerity or something. That's not the case. We know that societies are most happy when they have abundant social opportunities. For example, we had a reminder of that during COVID. We were locked down, but the things that we ended up treasuring the most were social interaction. And we have learned over time, and we see this from vast amounts of evidence, that continuing materialism, it doesn't hugely improve our happiness and what's good in life beyond a certain point, beyond a kind of minimum threshold of providing our needs and wants. Beyond that, it's a much murkier picture. It's not just like, oh, more consumption, a better iPhone, more cars, and so on make us happier. Sometimes it's the opposite. What we really value is certain social interaction, fulfillment through our work, learning and creativity, and so on. And that's one of the amazing situations about how we can deal with this crisis, is it doesn't require us to turn inward and collapse down societies. Far from it. We can make them far more abundant and fulfilling by investing in sociability, creativity, learning, fulfillment in work. At the end of the day, those are what we would describe as green things, because they don't require so much environmental destruction to do, and they can make us happier and healthier anyway. when we think of what China's been doing on the climate crisis, it makes us understand what this is all really about. It's about geopolitics. It's about the industries and opportunities of the future. Decades ago, I think before I was born, Chinese leaders were saying the Middle East has oil, we have rare earth minerals. And these are the minerals that use in batteries, in computer technologies, in the dominant technologies of the today. And they had a very deliberate strategy, working over decades, patiently investing in what they had, it turns out, rightly identified as the technologies of the future. If you look back over human history, there have been big industrial revolutions where a certain type of energy has then been exploited by a country that's become dominant globally. It was coal with Britain, then it was oil with America, and now it is a green industrial revolution. And China is at the forefront of that. This is not about, polar bears or rising sea levels or getting annoyed at someone sitting in the road in front of you. I mean, it is about all those things, but it is about geopolitics. And at the moment, China is getting vast benefits, reaping vast benefits from understanding that this is the wave of the future. It's already here. And other countries around the world have understood that. America has done it with its vast investments through what it calls the Inflation Reduction Act and other parts of the Biden administration agenda. The European Union gets it through its huge amounts of investment that it's now making in green technologies. These are not wishy-washy woke ideas that are being foisted on populations. This is the next industrial revolution, and we are late to the party. And it is where the huge economic opportunities, the good jobs, and the best technologies are sitting. And so China has done exceptionally well there, and it's incumbent on any country that's not caught up with that yet, including the UK, to get on that. That's what you should be doing economically, even if it wasn't a climate crisis. It is also the mechanism by which we will help sort that crisis out.